Hello and welcome back to Science of Medicine. I'd like to talk about your nervous system today, very much so from a clinical type standpoint so that you understand about this control system that is hardwired in your body. Now it's made up of two parts, a central nervous system which is composed of your brain and spinal cord, and a peripheral nervous system which we'll talk extensively about. And as I mentioned, this is a control system that is involved in the coordination and control of your body, particularly the motor or the movement parts from the muscle, the skeletal muscle, and sensory components that feed information into the central nervous system. Now, your brain is housed within your skull, your spinal cord within your spine. The peripheral nervous system has three parts. It has a sensing part, which is called the somatic, and it localizes to a particular region on the body that we call dermatomes. A motor part, which is for the skeletal muscle, which also localizes to the same kinds of regions, although they're called myotomes. And an automatic part called the autonomic nervous system, which has two components: the sympathetic nervous system, or the fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and relaxation. Now, the basic component of the nervous system is the neuron, and that's composed of a body with a nucleus, and that nucleus receives inputs from dendrites and will send outgoing information via axons. And sometimes these axons can be extremely long. For example, for those nerves that are controlling muscles in the lower extremities, that would mean that from the base of the spinal column, which would be from your lower back, all the way down to the tip of the toe, you might have an axon for most of that distance. That's a long way, and you need supporting cells to deal with that. And those supporting cells are called glial cells. Now, there are supporting glial cells that envelop the axon. In the peripheral nervous system, those are called Schwann cells. And in the central nervous system, those are called oligodendrocytes. And they wrap around the axon and help support it, and also help facilitate rapid conduction of the signal along it. Now, there are specializations of neurons. As I mentioned, in the peripheral nervous system, there are those that deal with the motor components as well as the sensory. In the central nervous system, most of the neurons are connections between neurons. Those are called interneurons. Now, as I alluded to, I'm going to, in this excitable cell, transmit information electrically. And that electrical signal transmission is going to occur just in a very similar fashion as what we had talked about with skeletal muscle. We're going to open ion channels and permit transduction. But if you had to do this across several feet of an axon, it would be a relatively slow process as you waited for adjacent ion channels to open up. And so one of the big functions of these glial cells, either the Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system or the oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system, are to myelinate or create an insulating fatty layer that is sheathing those neurons. And there are gaps between these glial cells that are called nodes of Ranvier. And what that does is make it so that the transmission of signal along that axon is occurring at those nodes, much like if you would think about the electric field emanating from those nodes and transmitting the signal in that fashion. And by doing that, it allows for very rapid conduction. And there are diseases in the nervous system where these oligodendrocytes can become disconnected from the axon. The most common one that people will have heard about is called multiple sclerosis. It's called a demyelinating disease because that glial cell of an oligodendrocyte is created of this fatty layer, which is called a myelin sheath. And when you demyelinate that, it means that the transmission of signal along that axon is much slower. So let's talk a little bit about the details of those action potentials, that is, that signal transduction. Now, all of my excitable cells, muscles, neurons will have some resting threshold potential. Normally that's going to be somewhere in -70, -80, -90 millivolts in the human body, and that's dictated by very small differences across the cell membrane from the charged species, sodium, potassium primarily. And this is maintained through the active transport of sodium, potassium. Now, once you receive some kind of a stimulus that is above a certain threshold, you will open up sodium channels. And since sodium is present in higher concentrations outside the cell than inside the cell, its natural spontaneous process will be to move from outside the cell to inside the cell, moving those few positive charges inside the cell and making it more positive with respect to what that resting state was. Now, very interesting chemistry and biology goes on here, but suffice it to say for this purpose, for this class, that you will shut down that sodium channel. There's actually a globular protein that's on the intracellular domain that will actually, after a very short period of time, on the order of milliseconds, will actually close that channel. At the same time as that membrane potential rises above a certain positive threshold, it will open up voltage-gated potassium channels. Potassium is present in higher concentrations on the inside of the cell versus the outside, so that will cause potassium to move outward from the cell and make the potential more negative. Now, there'll be a little bit of overshoot as the sodium channels are closed and until the potassium channels are also similarly closed, and then you can create a refractory period during which you cannot transmit any signal. Once you've done that, there'll be the sodium-potassium ATPase pump, which will restore that initial resting membrane potential. If I were to look at the detail of a neuromuscular junction as an axon with synapse with a muscle, I would see that there are many of these neuromuscular junctions. And remember that when that axon is actually, when that synapse is made between the neuron and the muscle, it will release acetylcholine, it will diffuse across the synapse, and when it diffuses across the synapse, it will bind with its receptor and open up the sodium channel. Now, in the central nervous system, as I mentioned, I have two components, the brain and the spinal cord. And I show here three different cross-sections of brain. And the first one here would be if I actually were to cut across in this fashion. The one that's enveloped in red here would be if I were to cut across this section. And then the one to its left would be if I were to cut in a plane like this. And what you can see is that there are some darker areas. We call those the gray matter. Those are composed of the cell bodies. And then these white matter areas, which are predominantly going to be the axons that are sheathed in oligodendrocytes. And so that's called the white matter. And you can see these white matter tracks that are going along here, or there's a large one that separates the left and the right side of the brain called the corpus callosum, which is actually shown in these two bottom problems. And if I look at the brain, much of the brain in my skull is comprised of what I call the cortex, the cerebral cortex. Lots of functions go on there. Things like thinking that you're doing right now as you're listening to this, the language, my ability to see, my memory, all of my ability to control my movements, to sense things from my environment. All of that are cortical functions. Now, back at the base of my brain, I have a portion of the brain called the cerebellum. The cerebellum is involved in taking a lot of signals that are coming in and coordinating those and providing for an accuracy of movements. So, for example, my cerebellum would be involved in me trying to actually touch my fingers together or touch my finger to my nose. The basal ganglia deep in the brain is controlling the speed at which you perform movements. So for example, if you were to clap your hands real rapidly, or you were to flip them back and forth, that is controlled through the basal ganglia. I also have a very primitive portion of the brain, which is the brainstem, that is involved in conducting signals from the spinal cord up into the cortex and the higher regions. I have a lot of my autonomic or automatic functions within this brainstem. For example, my respiratory centers are here. And I also have a set of nerves that come off from here that are called cranial nerves that control a lot of my face and head. Now within the cortex, I can divvy it up into different sections. As I mentioned before, I could say that I've got something on the right or the left hemisphere. There you've heard the terms things like right brain, left brain. That's one way to do it. As I mentioned, the corpus callosum is that white matter tract that is actually connecting those two. But if I look at the cortical divisions, I can also put the brain into the frontal lobe, the lobe that lies directly behind it, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe on the side, and in the back, the occipital lobe. And they have lots of different functions. I've highlighted just a few here. The frontal lobe is concerned with a lot of your executive functions, and that's why people will sometimes say, did you engage your frontal lobe, as a way of sort of dissing you and saying, did you really think about that before you did it? But there's also at the very back of the frontal lobe, right before the parietal lobe, a strip that is involved with the movement of your skeletal muscles. That's called the motor strip. Just behind the frontal lobe is the parietal lobe, and a number of things go on there, but immediately behind the frontal lobe, there is a sensory strip, much like the motor strip, that is concerned with sensing the things from your peripheral nervous system. On the sides, the temporal lobe is concerned also with lots of functions, but language being that, not necessarily the idea of moving my mouth, but instead with the concept of putting together concepts and integrating things to be able to allow me to speak, to be able to store that information. And then in the very back of my skull, I have the occipital lobe, which is involved in processing and figuring out about seeing. And that's why sometimes people will be blind if they have trauma to the back of their brain, because it actually is damaging that occipital lobe, and that's called cortical blindness. It has nothing to do with how your eyes are working or not working. It's just that the processing center for those eyes is damaged. Now, I'm going to describe what we've observed in terms of the nervous system and not explain necessarily why this is constructed in this fashion, because we don't really know per se why this is. But in the cortex, as I mentioned to you, in the frontal lobe, there's a strip of cortex. So what I've shown here on this, what we call a homunculus, is a cut that looks like this across the frontal lobe or the parietal lobe. If it's the frontal lobe, I'm concerned with motor. If it's the sensory lobe or the parietal lobe, I'm concerned with that sensory. And to help physicians make sense out of this, there is a mapping, which is called a homunculus, where we observe where things like the control of the hand or the foot or things like that would actually be located. Now, the reason for me actually sharing this with you is so that you would see that there is a mapping, there is a unique mapping to the brain. And this hardwired system is paired as you go through your early life. So we've all seen babies that then go into toddlers, and all of that information that is being processed by that young child is actually helping develop this hardwired system. Certain connections are being made and certain connections are being pared back as I go through and learn how to do certain skills. On the front side, or the anterior side, I have vertebral bodies, and we divvy these up into different sections. In the neck or cervical region, we call these cervical. In the mid portion, we call these thoracic, for the thoracic cavity. And in the lower portion, we refer to these as the lumbar region. There's a fused region which does not contain your spinal cord, which is called the sacrum, and we're all familiar with the coccyx. Now, these bony structures are actually numbered based on where they go from the top down, and you can feel on the back of your neck a prominent prosthetic that comes out that is at the C7 or the cervical 7. There are 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, and 5 lumbar regions, and nerves that come off are actually named according to these. And so those nerves that are exiting from the spinal cord have a name associated with them, which is based on where they're actually coming off. There's some subtlety, especially in the cervical region, in terms of how they actually come off that I won't deal with here, that makes it so that the numbering is a little bit weird in terms of things. Now, it turns out that in order to do this in a coordinated fashion, I need to have certain tracks. And I show here in this picture an example of a cross-section of the spinal cord where the blue tracks are tracks that are dealing with sensory information that is going upwards to the brain, and the red tracks are motor, which are controlling the muscle, which are going down the spinal cord. And my purpose in showing this is not that you would learn all of these tracks as you would in medical school, but instead to actually have you understand that there is a system to this. And as you can imagine, the further out that you are, that you will actually come off of the spinal cord in a very coordinated type of fashion. As you come off, you will send a nerve root that will go out to the body, and then as you come back, it will come back in through and synapse with inner neurons here within the spinal cord. Now, all of these, the brain and the spinal cord, are also sheathed in a fluidic system to help protect it. That is the fluid of the cerebral spinal fluid that is used. Now, one of the confusing parts for some people to understand is that it turns out that when you try to localize or figure out where a signal has come from based on something you see, you have to understand these tracks. And I'm going to show you some simple kinds of things that you understand generally about where things are located. So if it turns out that I have a signal that says, flex my index finger, that signal is actually originating on the opposite side of my brain. And in this case, since a motor function, it's in the frontal lobe. It travels down, and at the base of the brain, it crosses over. Why? You can have lots of arguments for why, but I'm simply describing that it does actually cross over and then goes down. And this is a very important consideration, because let's say a person has a stroke, and that stroke kills a portion of their neurons in their cerebral cortex. The symptoms will be on the opposite side of where the damage was actually done, and that's because of this crossing over. Similarly, on the sensory side, if I were to touch my fingertip, when I touch the fingertip like this, the sensory will actually also be on the opposite side, although this case, since it's in the sensory strip, it's going to be in the parietal lobe. Here, the crossing doesn't occur at the base of the brain, it occurs in the spinal cord, and it normally occurs within a few levels of where it actually goes in. That detail's not important for what we're doing right now, but you cross over. So again, if I had numbness on one side of my body, that would indicate that I would have damage on the opposite side of the brain to what I'm actually seeing on the body. Now, I mentioned that the brain and the spinal cord are housed within sort of a fluidic system. That fluid is called the cerebral spinal fluid. But I also have a coating, and that's actually 3 layers thick of the brain and spinal cord. Collectively, these are called the meninges. And the meninges provide that protection. You may have heard of a thing called meningitis, which can be a very serious and even life-threatening disease that can be caused by a bacterium, for example, although meningitis can be caused by many things. And in that, there's inflammation of these outer coating within the brain. And I just showed you a very small picture of those meninges, which are in here. Your brain has to get blood in order to operate. This is actually looking at IV contrast that has been placed to allow for visualization of the blood vessels that are going up into the brain. Basically, if you think about blood supply coming out of the left ventricle is going out through the aorta, and the aorta will split off. On the front side, I have 2 large blood vessels that go up the front that are called the carotid arteries. That's where you can feel pulses. And then on the back side, there are also arteries that are called the vertebral arteries that go up on your spinal areas. And when you do that, those vertebral arteries will then combine to what's called the basilar artery. There is a connection that exists between this anterior or front section of blood flow and the back or posterior circulation. It's called the circle of Willis, that just allows for collateral circulation. But you want your brain to get lots of blood, because without that, you die. Some of you have heard about stroke. Presently, that is the 5th leading cause of death in the U.S., having about 140,000 deaths per year as a result. It comes in 2 types: ischemic, which means that you have a clot, which anything downstream of that clot has no blood flow. That clot can be from different things. It can be from a small blood clot. It can be from a plaque that is actually gone. It can be from an embolism of some material that gets occluded as the bloodstream goes down. It's the most common kind of stroke, and there are very well-known established risk factors for this, such as high blood pressure and smoking. The other kind of stroke, which is less common but still prevalent, is hemorrhagic stroke. That's where you have a blood vessel that bursts and bleeds, and when that artery ruptures, then there's no blood flow that goes downstream of that, and so the cells downstream die. So when a person has had a stroke, the brain neurons downstream of that stroke die because they don't have blood flow. And unless that blood flow is established very rapidly, then they will die. Now, the peripheral nervous system is comprised of 3 parts. I mentioned to you before about the sensory, which is the sensation. So, for example, if I touch my index finger, if I'm touching my index finger, I will have sensation from sensory cells within my skin that will send signals back to my spinal cord, and then will go and cross and go up to my parietal lobe. That follows a certain type of what are called dermatomes. And these are areas that I can localize to. And I'll show you or tell you about some typical dermatomes just to get levels. So if I look at my head is mostly in the cervical region. My arms are also in the cervical region, although there's one thoracic for that, also present in terms of this. But an easy way to remember this is C7. C7 is this, okay? If you remember that, you'll always remember C7. I get down into my thoracic region, and if I were to look at where my nipples would be placed, that is at approximately the T4 region. And where my belly button is placed is at approximately T10. So you can kind of divvy up things in between that. Your genital region is generally in your sacral, and your lower extremities, your legs, are mostly in the lumbar region. And that's a good overview to give you some sort of idea of where that is. It's not strictly correct. There's some sacral roots that go down the back of your leg and go on your foot, but for the most part, this serves you well. Similarly, the muscle or the motor ones that allow me to flex my finger are associated with the same kinds of things, but we call them myotomes. So for instance, if I do this, that means that I have excited from if this is my left middle finger, that means that I've gone from my right frontal lobe and exited at C7 in order to have this. I can engage muscles and disengage muscles in a reflex manner. So for example, if I have a reflex hammer and I were to strike down below my knee, patella, which is the little bony part that's out front, and strike a tendon, it would initiate a reflex. And that reflex would send a signal, a sensory signal actually from muscle spindles, back to my spinal cord. But evolutionary-wise, sometimes it's faster and more efficacious for us to simply respond than it is for us to engage our cortex. So once that reflex goes back to our spinal cord, it will cause a reflex muscle jerk, the knee jerk, if you will, as well as send signals up to your brain. So for processing. And this is useful not so much if I strike somebody's patella and look at a reflex, but instead, let's say I touched something very hot. I don't want to have to process that because I can damage my skin or my tissue while I'm holding on and then my brain saying, let go of that hot object. So instead, the spinal cord reflex will allow me to withdraw or drop that hot object, and then my brain will process it. And so in this fashion, really an accurate temporal description is I have some noxious stimulus, I release or remove or retract from that noxious stimulus, and then I will say, oh, that was a noxious stimulus, ow, or something like that. The last part of the peripheral nervous system is called the autonomic nervous system, and this has an anatomical basis, which I really won't talk so much about here, but I'm based on two subsystems within the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic, or the fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic, or the rest or relaxation. And they involve the central nervous system, which goes out into the peripheral nervous system. So the easy way to remember whether it is sympathetic or parasympathetic is if you had some sort of potential or perceived threat, you would try to run away from that or you would try to fight it. What would you need in order to do that? You'd want to be able to see it as best possible. You would want to dilate your pupils. You'd want to run away or fight, so you would increase your heart rate so your cardiac output would go up. You'd want to dilate your bronchi so that you could ventilate more rapidly. You would release things like adrenaline, which would also spur a lot of the muscle actions, heart rate, things that we just said. You want to be able to have access freely to glucose, so glycogen, the storage polymer of glucose, you want to be able to convert that very rapidly to the glucose. And then you want to shut down processes that don't really matter. For example, I don't really need to spit during a time when I'm trying to fight something. I don't need to digest food, so my peristalsis, my gastrointestinal tract, blood is shunted away from that so that I can shunt it to places that I need it, such as my muscles. And I generally don't want to defecate or urinate on myself, so I'll inhibit that. On the other hand, my parasympathetic nervous system is when I'm in a relaxed state. In a relaxed state, my pupils will constrict, my heart rate can decrease, I don't need dilated bronchi to breathe and ventilate. I can digest things, I can go to the bathroom. All of those are part of my parasympathetic nervous system. So let's talk about an example. Which of the following might be observed in a person with an ischemic stroke in the left frontal lobe of the brain? difficulty breathing, difficulty with balance, difficulty with vision, right arm numbness, or right arm weakness. So if you said right arm weakness, that's correct. So remember that the frontal lobe is concerned with certain executive functions, but also has the motor strip, which controls the right side of the body. Consequently, right arm weakness would be the best choice of these. The breathing would be controlled down in the brainstem, balance in the cerebellum. The vision would be associated with the occipital lobe of the cortex. And right arm numbness would be associated with a left parietal sensory strip lesion. I will see you next time.